It's a complicated subject on the fascisms. It is said that Trump is a fascist, and it may be. But one fascist is an oxymoron. It's meaningless. It is a movement with a prologue and or a predisposition. I think European culture is predisposed to fascism. Trump is a businessman, a CEO. They are supposed to be authoritarian, the buck stops here kind of thing, like a general in an army who is defined by obedience, the obedience of his soldiers, which is built into the rationale of the military. From watching the presidents go by, I'd say most of them allow themselves to be modified by advisors. But we do call them commander-in-chief. That is the title, not the collaborator-in-chief. And Trump is famously moderated by every advisor, unlike the other fascists we know and hate. Maybe he fakes the single simple-mindedness, knowing he lacks it. My own impression is that one already has a fascist state by the time a leader shows up. The toxicity of European culture is a theme of mine. It is the culture I know and is probably no worse than any of the equivalents were there one, but its claim to superiority, relentless, blatant, or implied, is just revolting. And insistence on blaming individuals for its cultural imperatives is just sad, if typical. I haven't studied up on how the Germans explained Nazism to themselves with an eye to preventing its recurrence. It's a good idea. I have an impression they might say, well, we were a young state, 70 years old, still moving away from monarchy and feudalism. They still are. Slowly, which meant we didn't have solid institutions to stop the rise of a Reich. This does not seem to be the case in the US, at least in their own minds. They believe very clearly they created a non-fascist system that's never before been seen on the planet, on the face of this earth. I think there is a certain decency in an elite trained at the best schools to lead a country, the English model, and that it will move slowly along until conditions change. And they do change. Without a watchful eye, a China will rise up and take away your manufacturing domination and synthesize fentanyl, stuff like that. Or your billionaires crazy as Roman emperors will influence policy. But none of this happens without the schism and divide created when a republic masquerades as a democracy. When systems allow individual accumulations of wealth like we do and fight wars to maintain the sources of that wealth, and when asked, say, but this is the greatest country on the face of the earth ever, and somehow believing it, you're going to tend fascist. A culture can only really sustain so much propaganda before it leaks and goes fascist quite easily. That England as empire was a horrible place to live in if one was not white, male, and wealthy is accepted as a cost of that peculiar civilization. Just doesn't hold up anymore. And the effort to reinstitute serfdom, which they seem to be doing, will also lean fascist. This has been what has happened in both countries and probably in the other of the eight, the Great Eight, or whatever they call it, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 38 countries all wearing suits, mostly developed nations. I think in my childhood I was convinced of a sort of mammoth trickle down, that a billionaire would be rare and the billion would be evidence of some magnificent quality. And of course, in a successful country, the distribution of wealth would be fair enough to keep us, not billionaires, fat and happy, but that's not happened. What has happened makes sense if one actually goes back to Rome or Versailles and just tells the kids that no, some of us were born to rule and that this democracy stuff was just a very clever ruse to think, as Chomsky does, that voting in for the lesser of two evils is fine and only takes 5 seconds, please. In my 35 years in the US, equality remains a nice line in a document. And I do mean equality of outcomes because that is the only equality that counts. In this 35 years, I've seen half Democrats in the White House and no difference in the actual fascism of this inequality. History is instructive if it's not hagiography, so stop writing it. In other words, there is a fascist tendency in the civilizations I know, and I think, especially since Trump was elected fair and square in 2024, he is the choice of enough people. And if they are still his choice within a year in, he remains a democratic fascist. We were steeped in authoritarian in Europe right up to the early 20th century when, incidentally, women got the right to vote and landless working men. It seems that pre-Trump in the 20th and 21st, Western leadership was full of Anthony Edens, with the odd de Gaulle and Churchill, along with Mussolini, Stalin, Franco, Hitler. These chaps also hit the headlines, and power as an older colonial order dissolved. Monarchs were fascist by default, few as awful as, for instance, Ferdinand and Isabella. And as long as we keep a warm place in our hearts for these monsters, we keep the fires of fascism burning low to flare up now and again. It seems that civilizations near and far have fascist authoritarian impulses lurking in wait for hard times. If democracy snuck closer to democracy, in fact, as late as the early 20th century, it's a shame that we didn't replace our old scriptures with new in the new light of day, when the ludicrous bundling of democracy and republic could be undone in our minds. The myth we make from Rome is that republic replaces monarchy, but it doesn't. It just changes hats. I always wonder, when was America great that we might make it so again? Before the 1920s? Before 1965? After the Emancipation Proclamation? During Jim Crow? You tell me. I think Trump is hankering after a police state, which is bad enough, but depends on a willing police force, which is as Hillary Clinton as it is Trump. It is complicated to center fascism on its leaders or figureheads, imagining a benign Germany, Italian, or Spanish culture before the clearly lunatic leaders showed up and took power and started behaving like medieval kings is just stupid, especially if those populations are taught in school of monarchic golden ages, which they are. I think the Trump voter was once the Reagan voter and the Nixon voter. They seem at least slightly nicer men, but Reagan especially rung the bell of trickle-down enthusiastically, adopted by future Democrats, and gross wealth inequality is the best of mediums for authoritarianism. We have to convince the electorate that the billionaires deserve the billions, and that one day we will too. This indoctrination is the nervous system of fascism. To accept as just and natural this kind of income inequality brings with it a need of hierarchy of value. Merit. It's a parkway in New York. My YouTube has just lit up the Peasants' Rebellion, 1381, and its leaders John Wycliffe, John Ball, and Wat Tyler, 500 years before the lauded Thomas Jefferson. Quote, I think John of Gaunt was a reasonable, honorable man, says the voice of the documentary and the Shakespeare. Quote, he could be ruthless, but was really trying simply to preserve the authority of Richard II. Richard believed he was special, and he was special. He was the king. Documentary 2021, still pushing the notion. It is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. It is not in our leaders, but in ourselves that we are underlings.